Patch 11.7 brings new skins, returning items from Smite's history, some crazy buffs, and more. Here's your quick patch day breakdown of everything you need to know. Jumping in with the new skins, we have Court Archer Cupid and Court Charmer Aphrodite in the new cross-gen pass. High Honor Mulan and Summer Fun Medusa are in the Immortal Honor event, and Mr. Squishy Mia is in the Squishy chest. Medusa's Deathmatch, the 3v3v3 game mode, will be returning in patch 11.7. Joust is getting some sweeping changes this patch as well, with increased XP and gold spooling, increased gold from camps and minions. The Demon King now debuffs player damage and healing on hit, scales in power and protections as well as the normal health scaling, and becomes enhanced at 12 minutes, after which his buff gives an additional 10% penetration. All structures and the Titan have also had their stats shifted around, with the tower having less health but more power and damage, the Phoenix having way more health and more damage, and the Titan having more health and less magical protections. Moving into item balance though, first up, Vampiric Shroud gets 5 more power and Bloodsoaked Shroud gets an increase to its passive healing. Fighter's Mask gets 5 more physical power and 10 more magical power. Protector's Mask gets a 100 gold cost reduction. Warlock Staff gets 100 more base health, the stacks remain unchanged. Ethereal Staff's health steal effect now lasts longer and can stack 4 times instead of 3. Cannonier's Cuirass gets a 150 gold cost reduction. Arendite can now be purchased by hunters, and Failnot can now be purchased by assassins and warriors. Heavenly Wings and all its upgrades get a 10-second reduction to their cooldown. Meditation and all its upgrades get an increase to their healing. Bracer and all its upgrades get a 2-second longer buff duration, and Divine Barrier and all its upgrades get an increased deploy range. Some fan favourite items from Smite's history are returning in patch 11.7, first up being Hastened Fatalis. This costs 2500 gold, comes with 100 health, 10 penetration, 20% attack speed and 7% movement speed, with the same passive it always had, removing the basic attack movement penalty for 1 second after hitting a basic attack. As a result, Hasten Ring and Hasten Katana have been removed from the game. Another hunter item returns in Ikival, which costs 2200 gold and comes with 20 physical power, 25% attack speed, 10 flat pen, and the passive that every basic attack hit increases your power by 5 and reduces the enemy power by 5 physical and 10 magical respectively, for a max of 4 stacks. Stonecutting Sword is up next, which costs 2300 gold and comes with 35 physical power, 7% movement speed, and the passive that basic attacks reduce enemy physical protection by 7 and increase yours by 7 for a max of 3 stacks. Ring of Hecate is also returning with some minor adjustments from its original form. It costs 2400 gold and comes with 55 magical power, 20% attack speed and 15 flat penetration, with a passive that every successful basic attack increases your power by 5% and reduces the enemies by 5% as well, for a max of 3 stacks. And Chile is back too at 2200 gold with 200 health, 45 magical protection, 20 HP 5, and the passive that whenever you take magical damage from an enemy ability, you silence all enemies around you in a 30 unit range for 1 second with a cooldown of 30 seconds. While this effect is on cooldown, you gain 20 physical and 35 magical power. Hide of the Nemean Lion is back with its original passive effects of reflecting 15% of all basic attack damage back to the attacker. It costs 2450 gold and comes with 200 health, 50 physical protection and 20 HP 5. Shield of the Phoenix is technically a brand new item, but it takes the effect of the original Gladiator shield, so it's basically a returning one. It costs 2350 gold and comes with 250 health, 30 physical protection, 20 HP 5 and 10% cooldown reduction, with a passive that every successful ability hit on an enemy god restores 2% max health and mana once per ability. And finally, for the returning items, we have Shifter's Shield, which costs 2400 gold and comes with 300 health, 30 of each protections, 20 HP 5, and a passive that while over 75% health, you gain 30 physical and 45 magical power, and while under 75% health, you gain 20 of each protections. Moving on to god changes though, Medusa's damage and cooldown on Viper Shot have been nerfed, her acid spray damage has been reduced, and her ultimate damage is reduced, and the cooldown is increased by 10 seconds. Mulan's 2 has had its base damage and bonus damage reduced, her 3 now scales down from 15 seconds to 13 seconds rather than being 13 flat, and the initial hit of her ultimate has had its damage reduced. Gekulin's 1 in normal form has had its damage and cooldown nerfed, while his ultimate in normal form gets similar treatment. Nua's Clay Soldier's protection debuff has been reduced, and the cooldown on her 3 has been increased by 1 second. Yanis's Unstable Vortex has had its damage reduced, and the threshold bonus damage scaling has also been reduced. Agni's passive damage has been nerfed by 2% scaling per tick, and his 2's cooldown has been increased slightly, and his ultimate's damage has been nerfed slightly as well. Geb's damage on his 2 has been nerfed, the shield health on his 3 has been reduced, and the base damage of his ultimate has also been decreased. Bacchus has had his belly flop cooldown increased by 1 second, his 3's cooldown now scales down to 12 seconds from 14 rather than being 12 seconds flat, and his ultimate has been nerfed, though the patch notes are buggy here and don't show what was actually changed. Thanatos' Death Scythe has had its damage nerfed, and the cooldown now scales down from 14 seconds to 12 rather than 12 seconds at all ranks, and the penetration of his 2 has been nerfed by 5 at all ranks. And finally for nerfs, Thor's base health has been decreased, his 3's cooldown now scales down to 10 seconds from 12 rather than 10 seconds flat, and his ultimate's base damage and lightning arc damage have both been decreased. Moving into buffs though, first up we have Hades, and his ultimate now scales down to 70 seconds at max rank rather than 90 seconds at all ranks. Kronos gets more base health and physical protection, as well as a decreased mana cost and cooldown on his 2. Kabrakan's 1 is now 14 seconds flat rather than scaling from 16 seconds down to 14, and the protections gained from his 2 have been increased. Ymir's Frostbite damage reduction has been increased from 10% to 15%, and his freeze is now 14 seconds flat rather than 16 scaling down to 14. Yamoja's basic attack healing has been increased, the slow on enemies hit by her 3 has been increased, and her ultimate now scales down to 120 seconds at max rank rather than 140 seconds flat. Fafnir's 2 now scales down to 14 seconds at max rank rather than being 16 seconds flat, and his ultimate's duration has been increased in the early game but remains the same at max rank. Erlang's 3 in turtle form now knocks up enemies again. Rejoice, Erlang mains! Jack's 1 gets a damage increase, his 3 gets a reduced mana cost, and his ultimate gets a damage increase as well. Nox's passive candles now provide more magical power per stack, the damage scaling on her 2 has been increased from 100% to 110%, and her 3 gets a mana cost reduction. Set's passive attack speed has been increased from 2.5% to 3% per stack, and his ultimate now scales down to 70 seconds at max rank rather than 90 seconds flat. Maman's 1 now gets full healing value from item procs rather than 25% to fix interactions with items like Bumba's Dagger and Vampiric Shroud. Izanami gets more penetration per stack on her passive and an increased silence duration on her ultimate. Nut gets increased damage on her 2, and her 3 is now 12 seconds at all ranks rather than scaling from 14 down to 12. Ratatoska's Acorns all gain more physical power, and the tank Acorns also gain an increase to their on-hit healing. And finally, Ra gets more health per level, an increase to his 2's power scaling, and the cooldown of his 3 now scales down to 13 seconds at max rank rather than 15 seconds flat.